So, I think most people know what kind of stuff in the meta right now is bad. Pencil, shot, Trizooka, that kind of thing gets a lot of attention. But what's the good part about all the weapon diversity we got? Well, it's the prominence of one type of weapon. The midline. Mid-range heavy metas have typically been some of the favorites throughout the Splatoon series. Endgame Splatoon 1 had one with weapons like Range Blaster, H3, Dynamo, and Slosher. And while it's not Splatoon 2's most famous meta, version 5.2's, which centered around weapons like Brella, H3, Bamboo, and Dually Squelcher, was actually pretty well liked, just kinda got fumbled a bit with main power-up also being in the game at that time. And today, it's the best part about the current meta. So why are mid-range weapons so favored? What do they bring to the table? How do they change the game, and what should be done about them in the future? Today I'm going to talk about that and a few of the meta developments that have happened with the most recent patch. Be sure to subscribe if you enjoy, and let's get started. So let's talk about a few traits of mid-range weapons that have been in these kind of metas. First off, typically mid-range weapons are some of the stronger weapons in the entire series, but also come with important key weaknesses. For example, H3, back when it was good in Splatoon 2 and Splatoon 1, has its famous one-tap kill, where if you connect all 3 bullets in one burst, it can give you an incredibly fast kill time. However, the weapon also has horrible speed, having way more end lag than any other shooter, and it's not even close. The Dually Squelcher and Wiper are both pretty similar. These are incredibly fast weapons for their range value, but suffer in terms of having very slow kill times for the most part. Range Blaster is another example, giving a large area of effect and an insane one-shot direct, but comes with poor weaknesses of paint and speed. Slosher is one that's been a lot more common, probably the main midline of this entire meta, in which the unique slosh arc of the weapon gives it high damage at unique attack angles. However, the weapon is also very easily trapped, since it has such a horrible time trying to paint its own feet and move on its own. What's important to note here is that the weaknesses these weapons have add to the satisfying feeling of how powerful these weapons are. For instance, an H3 that's landing multiple one-taps back-to-back is partially as impressive as it is because the weapon would get run down otherwise. A Wiper or Dually Squelcher multi-kill usually feels impressive because of the insane amount of time they have to be dodging enemy attacks to make up for how much slower their kill time is. And the examples go on. Another thing that's nice, particularly for Splatoon 3, is it helps a lot of the weaker specials in this game feel a lot more usable and common. Things like Splatter Color Screen, Wave Breaker, Inkstorm, Bubble, or any other specials that don't take away your main gun will typically not feel that bad on a main gun that's pretty good, because for the most part, you want to keep using that weapon as long as possible. So it means that we see a lot more of specials we wouldn't typically see, without it being a huge downside for team comps. Another important part about these mid-range metas is they tend to have better pacing than the short-range weapons. Let me elaborate on that for a little bit. Short-range weapons have better mobility, but mid-range weapons have an easier time fighting because, well, usually that's what they're made to do. And even more flexible mid-range weapons like Dynamo, H3, or Dread, when balanced properly, can still totally fight just fine. That, paired with, well, being more mid-range, means these weapons can pick fights a lot more often and result in the pacing of matches going up. Compare this to what short-range weapons have to deal with in mid-range metas. Let's talk about Splattershot, for example. Shot usually is going to struggle pretty heavily fighting mid-range focused comps. I mean, it's not going to beat a Nautilus, approaching a Squeezer is a pain, Stamper's going to combo it or one-shot it, and the list goes on. Shot makes up for this by still being able to punish these weapons if it gets close enough, having insane mobility compared to them, and of course, being able to play around its kit more, where it typically will have a stronger kit than the opponent's. However, Splattershot has gotten toned back since Splatoon 2. The bomb it has is 180 damage with a slightly smaller blast radius. Blast Cheffer got nerfed, meaning you can't have them as frequently, and the points per special on the weapon is 210, compared to the 190 it had earlier, or the 180 back in Splatoon 2. What this means for Splattershot is its opportunity windows where it has these big plays are a bit less impactful. Think of Splattershot as a weapon that typically has less value than mid-range weapons, but has those spikes when it can do things like have impactful bomb spam, or have a really good Trizooka. So when it can't do those as often, Splattershot gets less value throughout a match. Of course, you could mitigate it with things like last-ditch effort, or running a bunch of charge-up, for example, but that means you're taking away from other gear abilities that Shot is using to keep up. A lot of a Shot's build right now is things like swim speed or intensify action that help it keep up fighting-wise with these mid-range weapons, and you're going to lose some of those abilities if you're running stuff like charge up. Now, none of this is to say Shot is bad. Shot is totally fine. The most recent Area Cup had 3 of them in top 4, and and the weapon is still incredibly accessible for how good it is. So it's gonna be a top tier weapon that is gonna stick around. But it's important that this weapon is actually starting to have some downsides, and this goes for other short range weapons that play around their kits, stuff like Splashomatic or Tenatech for example. And this brings me to my final point about mid-range weapons, since they typically are a bit more ink hungry, don't really have as much room to use their subs as much, and also don't play around their specials as often, which means generally, sub and special output go down in a mid-range meta, which is a big part of why people tend to like it. Fights being more main weapon focused, with the subs and specials more supporting those fights, is something a lot of people like. And typically that's where mid-range plays in. The development that we've been seeing from all of this is we've been seeing a different trend of short-range weapons. The main winner of this is the 52 gal. This weapon has much better stats than most short-range weapons, and most notably, a bit more range and painting range, meaning paired with subs and specials that more enhance the main weapon, since Curling Bomb can help with mobility, and Splash Wall can help wall out areas against mid-range weapons that can't spam it as much, paired with specials like Wail and Scream that help with entry without taking away your weapon, and honestly, the fact that its kits are less important with cheaper specials means that it has more gear freedom to run things like mass swim speed up, aka, this is a short-range weapon that is gonna play like a mid-range weapon. There's also options like Dually. This has a kit that's cheaper than vanilla Splattershot, being only 190p, but comes with a stronger main weapon for fighting with more enhanced options, in this case being the dodge rolls to help close the gap. Dually does struggle at fighting a lot more than 52, but in this case you still get a kit that can help you get in, which I think is important to have options like that accessible. Otherwise, lockouts with a lot of mid-range weapons that struggle to get in could be a little bit annoying, so weapons like this are important for the meta. I think we're going to see a trend to using these weapons more often, and in fact, at Worlds before the patch even happened, these were both weapons Jackpot was running, and I've seen more top players experiment, especially with 52 recently. Now, look, the meta's still not perfect. Specials are still way too weak, even if they're attached to stronger options, and Zuka is still kind of BS. But the most important part is Pencil. Pencil might be 10 points more expensive, but Pencil doesn't really care. The cooler weapon still needs to live a lot of the time, giving an advantage to it and edit splatling. And Pencil has plenty of gear freedom. It stacked a bunch of charge up already, and it can continue to do that now, which means the plus 10 points for special isn't really felt as much. However, I think Pencil can still be good for the meta. Having a dynamic between anchor cooler weapons and aggro cooler weapons, like shown in this chart here, is a pretty cool dynamic. I think it means that one player on the team isn't assigned to be the cooler guy, and in tournaments where Pencil has been banned, I think that Edit and Zap have seen a pretty good dynamic between them. But if we can make stuff like some of the other weaker cooler options in the meta, including things that aren't good enough to be on this chart like H3, start to be used, and tone back Pencil a little bit more, that little bit of extra diversity would fit in pretty well. And options like H3 and Dynamo, being mid-range, would naturally fit very well into this meta. Even bigger of a concern I have than that, though, is the idea that these weapons might just get nerfed into the ground. I mean, we saw what happened to Machine when it was good for too long, and we're lucky Machine was one of the better midlines to nerf, since it played a bit more to fizzy spam. There are options right now that could be over-nerfed like Stamper, or even Reflux, which helps a lot with Turf Wars meta, a subject for another time. And, well, the last time I talked about Splash and Ballpoint as two healthy meta weapons, it didn't age so well. Flash is mostly fine, but Ballpoint on the other hand has been struggling with a lot of poor matchups, and Jetpack only getting worse as there have become more things that deal with it. In particular, all these mid-range weapons in Pencil do a pretty good job of shredding it out of the sky. So, what actually develops from this meta is going to be an interesting question. While the meta has a lot of downsides to it, there are still a lot of positives. It's part of that latent potential Splatoon 3 always has. If the game can be balanced in a way that removes some of the more annoying aspects, like Zuka, and improves some of the ones we like, such as buffing specials that could synergize well with this, like Super Chumps, or weaker specials like Stamp, as well as buffing some of the other mid-range weapons into the meta, like Dually Sculpture, we could be in for an amazing endgame Splatoon 3 meta. One that focuses on fighting and fast pacing, while still having impactful special plays for coordination. It could be the perfect Splatoon 1 and 2 hybrid that the devs probably want it to be. But right now, we're not there yet, and we could either go further down that route or further away from it. And that's why I think the updates from here, especially considering Worlds could affect the next balance patch now that it's not right after it happened, are going to be incredibly important. These last few updates for Splatoon 3 will shape what the game is going to be like for years to come. Let's hope they don't fumble it.